Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of you out there attending the first podcast virtual seminar of the Central Asian Connectivity Project here at the Center for the National Interest, project that we just launched late last year. And we plan on having discussions like these on various aspects of Central Asia's connectivity with the rest of the world on a monthly basis. And given, of course, that today is the 2-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it only seems appropriate to start with, for our first discussion, with looking at how Russia's profile and its influence has changed, is changing in Central Asia, and how we see that going. We have a terrific group of speakers. I will briefly introduce them in order of their who will speak. And we'll start with Professor Eric McGlinchey, who's an associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He's the author of Chaos, Violence, Dynasty, Politics, and Islam in Central Asia. And in addition to his academic publications, has offered commentary for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CBS Radio Canada, and many other media sources. Our second speaker is someone familiar to us here in Washington, Dana Masalimova. She is currently a fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. She is a former diplomat with the Foreign Service of Kazakhstan, and in 2021 was appointed alternate permanent representative of the International Maritime Organization. She previously served as the head of economic affairs at the embassy in Kazakhstan in London, and for about 5 years here in Washington as an officer of political affairs. And our third speaker is Gavin Helf, who is a senior expert now for Central Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he works on Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Before joining USIP, Gavin worked as the senior democracy and governance advisor in the USAID Asia and Middle East bureaus. He studied, lived, and worked in the USSR and his successor states from 1984 to 2007, mostly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, with non-governmental organizations and USAID. So thank you, all three of you, for agreeing to participate in our discussion today. And let's turn it over to Eric McGlinchey, who has some interesting survey research data that he will share for us.
Okay, so hopefully those slides are up for you guys to see. Great. So thanks, Andy. Thanks to the Center for National Interest for the invitation. And thanks to all of you who've joined today. I understand that there's a lot of collective expertise in this room, so I hope we can have a conversation. I'd love to hear your insights as well as the insights of my co-panelists. Andy asked us to kick off the discussion with this question of how Central Asian states and peoples pursue their interests in light of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So I'm going to tackle this question looking at the side of the people rather than the states. And I'm going to present some findings from, in this first 5 minutes, on surveys that we ran in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan in the fall of 2022, so over 6 months into the war. And I'll address 3 questions. Who's responsible for the war? Is this a special operation or a war? Looking at the Kremlin terminology here. And address this question of perhaps maybe the media you consume might influence your perception of the war. And let me just give you my central findings before getting into the data. The core thing I want to get across is that while some Central Asians blame Russia and others blame Ukraine for the war, almost all Central Asians blame the United States. So that's kind of the negative news here for those in Washington. I think that, given that some Central Asians do fault Russia for the war, I think is indicative of this growing sentiment that 3 decades into independence, these are policies that increasingly are trying to distance themselves, and I think successfully distancing themselves from the Soviet colonial legacy, and what I would say is this enduring disrespect for states that were once forcibly made to be part of the Soviet Union. If we get to the Navalny issue, this aspect of enduring disrespect is something that we can potentially talk about, given Navalny's own mixed discussion of the peoples of Central Asia. And then lastly, what I want to suggest is that this turning away from Russia critically is not a turning towards the United States. And I think Central Asia is a really helpful library for people in Washington and those who follow US foreign policy to think long and hard about why a lot of the stuff that people in this room may engage in, including myself, why it's falling flat in places like Central Asia. So those are the main points. Let me pull up the first slide here. So the question here is, who provoked the conflict in Ukraine? And if you look, I'll purchase something about the surveys, 1,000 people, nationally representative, again, fall 2022. The top bar, we have NATO. 70% of Kyrgyz, 55% of Kazakhs agree that NATO was responsible for provoking the war. But I should say these are not mutually exclusive, so you can agree with one question and agree with the other. What's, I think, striking is only 41% of Kyrgyz and 39% of Kazakhs responded that Russia provoked the conflict. A little more than, a little bit quicker to fault Ukraine. So 63% of respondents Kyrgyz respondents faulted Ukraine, and 50% of Kazakh respondents faulted Ukraine. But the big one, and this is where the really negative news is, 76% of Kyrgyz respondents and 59% of Kazakh respondents agreed with the statement that the United States provoked the conflict. Somewhat, I think, distressing when you think about who Central Asians are faulting for the war. Ultimately, the U.S. and the West is perceived as being responsible here. The plurality of Central Asian respondents will adopt the Kremlin framing that this is a special operation and not a war. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is this issue of whether or not the media you consume may influence your position. And one would expect that there would be a correlation, right? If you consume a lot of Russian media or US media, you would find Russia or the United States in a more positive or negative light. Here, the findings are kind of interesting. The overwhelming majority distrust Chinese state media and distrust US state media. But there's a large number of Central Asians who continue to see the Russian state media, Первый канал, for example, in a positive light. And this corresponds, I think, with the overwhelming view of who's at fault for the war. Central Asians are suspicious, I think, for many reasons, some of them perhaps justified, of the United States. And although, as I'll discuss later on when I present some focus group findings, although Central Asians will fault Russia, a large number of Central Asians both trust Russian media and are reluctant to lay all the blame for the war at Moscow's feet. So I'll stop there, and maybe later we can look at some of the focus group stuff.
Thanks, Gavin. That's a really interesting and provocative set of data to launch our discussion. And I'm sure that there'll be a number of questions and comments from your panelists. And also, I want to note that we have a large audience out there, a very impressive audience. And if you want to ask a question, please do so through the Q&A function on the Zoom site, and those will come to me, and we'll get to those to the extent that we can in the latter part of the program. So let me turn to Donna.
Okay, hi everyone again. Thank you so much, Andy, and the Center for National Interest for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be a part of this wonderful panel. Give me 1 second. I'll share my screen. So I have this beautiful slide with all this clips from the news posted here, because since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been a flurry of media coverage focusing on Russia's perceived diminishing influence in Central Asia. Headlines proclaimed Russia's loss of grip and waning power. These are the common themes. It's maybe, as Eric pointed out, there are several developments in the region. Some do support this view, some don't. Diplomatic engagements outside, important have been diplomatic engagements outside the traditional CIS zone, and extremely important regional talks that were outside the, the so-called C5+1 formats, with different powers, outside powers like the United States, China, the Gulf Cooperation Council. We also see some positive developments in the business sector. Last week, for example, in my mind, positive. Last week, for example, WebTech bought the locomotive assembly plant in Kazakhstan from the sanctioned Russian Transmash holding. Interestingly enough, in early 2023, there were news that Kazakhstan seized the property of Roscosmos at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a move that highlighted the shift in dynamics and the willingness of Kazakhstan to assert its interest. Yet, amidst these developments, I would argue that all these developments are more pragmatic acts of economic self-preservation and not really signs of a real break. Russia continues to exert significant influence politically and economically in Central Asia. And as you can see from this table, 2023 was business as usual, and Mr. Putin regularly met with Central Asian leaders, both bilaterally and in multilateral formats, mainly in Russia. Yesterday, the Central Asian presidents went to Kazan to meet with Putin. So in my presentation, I will focus on the nuances of Russia's economic presence, specifically in Kazakhstan, and will attempt to highlight the enduring factors of Russia's influence in the region. So if you look at this slide, at this infographic, so since Russia's invasion, Russia's big corporations have expanded their presence in the country. And the slide shows major sectors of Kazakh economy where Russia was able to deepen its presence despite sanctions, from coal and electricity to uranium and gas. We can talk about this trends during the discussion part later. A more dynamic trend can be observed in the small and medium enterprise sector. There has been a staggering increase in Russian-owned companies in Kazakhstan. Their number jumped from 11,000 before the war to over 23,000 last year. Russian-owned companies now account for 41% of the total number of foreign-owned entities in Kazakhstan. And interestingly enough, if you can see here from the slide, the bottom blue line shows 305%. It's a whooping increase, a whooping growth of Russian-owned entities in the Kazakh IT and communication sector. Now, the question is whether this trend reflects a significant influx of Russian investment. And the statistics from the National Bank of Kazakhstan, unfortunately, does not support this view. Even though Russia is indeed one of the top investors in Kazakhstan, yet its contribution pales in comparison with other countries such as the US, which is absolute champion in terms of net FDIs in the country, in Kazakhstan. Russia was also a top destination for net cash outflows in 2023. And if you look at the small table down there, with the figures show a staggering 767% increase. It's a trend that raises serious concerns about the true nature of Russia's cash flows into Kazakhstan. There is one powerful explanation, of course, for all this, why Kazakh elite has allowed all this to happen. We all know what can happen in the event of a prolonged disruption to the Kazakh oil exports via the CPC pipeline. So in my attempt to conclude on a more optimistic note, I want to say that I do see some positive trends in the region. I believe that Central Asia is finally embracing its identity as a region. It has increased diplomatic and trade engagement, both bilaterally, multilaterally. I was also happy to see that this year started with the bilateral visits by the Kazakh foreign minister to Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. The Uzbek foreign minister was in Kazakhstan just early this week. So I do see there is this renewed momentum surrounding connectivity and the region's desire to reintegrate into global value chains. Diversification of trading routes and trading partners is an absolute imperative for Central Asia. And I really hope that we will see Central Asians band together strategically to boost their negotiating power.
Thank you very much, Donna. That's some very interesting data, some of it quite counterintuitive, I think, to what many expectations might be in the role of Russian business and financial ties with Kazakhstan. Okay, Gavin, let's turn to you for the last of our opening remarks.
Okay, thanks, Andy. It's great to be working with you, and it's great to be presenting to this crowd today. Now, you know, as the last guy, I get to cross things off of my list of points as everybody else says them. But I've got a couple of things that I think answer the question of how Central Asian behavior might have changed with the invasion of Ukraine. The first one is, I think, you know, a lot of what the data that the other two presented belies this sort of idea that, you know, Kazakhstan and especially is having sort of a decolonization moment where suddenly a light bulb went off and people have started rejecting the Russian definitions of the past and the present. I think that's very true within, you know, intellectual circles, and certainly a lot of the people that we deal with, especially in Kazakhstan, you know, the narrative of decolonization and trying to reassess the legacy of things like Semipalatinsk and Baikonur and World War II and all of that. But for a lot of the population, it's still pretty 50-50, you know, to use really rough numbers in terms of how people look at this war. So that's still a really important thing to remember. On behavior, I become, really since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I have become much more of a believer in the sincerity of the multi-vector foreign policy of Central Asia and a balanced multi-vector foreign policy in Central Asia. It's genuine and it's very understandable. You know, you can see headlines like Donna showed of, oh, you know, Central Asia is moving towards the United States. You can also, you know, attend MGIMO seminars on the shrinking Western minority and the rising global majority that sort of suggest that Central Asia is pointing towards Russia. I think it's really important in your head to get the idea that none of these countries want to make a choice. You know, they have a balanced policy. I think that makes sense, given the fact that I'm going to Tbilisi this weekend, a conference where we're going to be talking about how the Euro-Atlantic umbrella extends over Ukraine, Moldova, and maybe the Caucasus, and then the Central Asians are going to be like, well, what about us? Nobody's extending that security umbrella over them. So they've got to pay attention to having good relations with all of their neighbors among the big powers, China, Russia, and the United States, and among the middle game powers, Iran, Turkey, and the others that are playing, India, that are playing a more serious role. We shouldn't try to push them to take a side. I think it was great when Blinken went back to try to reestablish the relationship with Central Asia, that it was more of a message of, hey, we're here to help you, you know, better balance your multi-vector foreign policy than like, you got to choose between us and the Russians. So that's one thing. I think, you know, we've seen a lot more interactivity between the Central Asian countries and other countries. So I have this News Now feed that I look at every morning, and the number of things, every article that talks about, you know, what's going on in Central Asia will have the flag of the country where it's coming from. And I see a lot more flags from India, Turkey, you know, the Gulf states in that feed than I ever saw before Ukraine. The second thing, and it's, you know, it is about the internal cohesion. The Central Asians are stronger. The five is stronger together than it is not together. And, you know, one of the things that we've seen is the five presidents, including Turkmenistan, the five presidents going on tour together. I was actually thinking you could do a rock, you know, a rock concert tour shirt, you know, Xi'an, you know, China, St. Petersburg, Russia, you know, New York Declaration, but there's also, you know, they spent 2 days virtual with Modi. They've gone and done Turkey. They've done C5 plus Europe. They've done Germany. They've done Japan, Korea. You could have a really good, you know, tour concert T-shirt for that. And they all stick together. One of the things that I did, you know, after the Dushanbe meeting of the five presidents and the C5+1 meeting in New York, is I took all of those declarations. There's the Russian one, the C5+R, and the China Xi'an Declaration and the New York Declaration, and I kind of cross-tabulated them, and they all read very much the same. The five Central Asian presidents are making the same talking points, and they're agreed upon talking points clearly. So their interaction with the outside world is one that they're trying to do coherently. If you want to see what they don't have agreement on yet, you look at the Dushanbe, you know, meeting where they were trying to figure out what they should do about Afghanistan or some other things. But they really do have a lot of consistency in how they are engaging the outside world as a five. I think that, you know, if we look back to, you know, the period before the Russian invasion, we were already seeing sort of splits between the Central Asian countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, leading to inroads and military competition between Iran and Turkey, you know, on that chessboard. We were seeing a lot more disunion between the countries. And I think so one of the big changes is the extent to which there's a coordinated effort to engage the outside world to get the things that it needs, but it's a balanced one. It's not a side-picking one. So I'll leave it at that. I think those are the two really big takeaways of what's changed since the war started. Over.
So much, Gavin. It seems only appropriate that the dude with the guitars in the background comes up with the image of the world tour of the five Central Asian leaders. That is a T-shirt that I think I would buy.
Yeah,
personally.
I would say you could probably make 50 of those, and that would probably be enough. But you know, for a certain crowd, it would be.
Well, start small and see what the response is. So let me follow up on a couple of some points that were made by the three of you. I guess first, Eric, to you and everybody, feel free to respond to these questions as I lay them out. But it is striking seeing the survey research data identifying you know, the United States and NATO as the cause of the war, as opposed to Russia. I guess my question is, I remember in 2014 with the seizure of Crimea and then the onset of the war in the Donbass, in April, as that was just getting underway, I was in Kazakhstan and talking with, you know, one of our colleagues and a number of our colleagues in Kazakhstan, and there was definitely an increased sense of vulnerability that the Kazakhs certainly felt, particularly when Mr. Putin used the term Nova Rossiya, the territory that was taken in the 19th century and that fell under the administrative framework of the Russian territory. Beyond the survey research data, to you, Eric, and to others, do the countries have a sense of a greater vulnerability in light of what Russia is doing in Ukraine?
I think Don is going to be able to say a lot about Kazakhstan, because that's been a flashpoint, right, with the northern Kazakhstan and the things that various populist leaders, including Putin, have said about Kazakhstan. So I'd be very interested. Let me just, what Donna has to say, but let me just give you some of the focus group stuff that we have on Russia. And, with the focus groups, we specifically asked to get narratives that were that focus on the U.S. and focus on Russia, focus on China, focus on Ukraine. So these are not representative. So I just want to get that caveat out there. But one of the things that came through strongly in the focus groups is that Putin has colonial ambitions, imperialist ambitions, and that one of the respondents said that, quote, Putin is old and he sees incorporating Ukraine into Russia to be his legacy. And I think one could extrapolate from that and say, well, maybe northern Kazakhstan as well, right? And I think that's a constant fear. I think the respondents were actually worried about Putin's mental acuity and whether or not he was like fully there and what he might do in Central Asia. So we had several who said that he's senile, he's detached from reality. Some said he's a narcissist, and that this was an attempt to distract the population away from the regime's shortcomings. And the implication is, well, northern Kazakhstan could be another place where this would happen. So I think there is a real fear there. I also think that, and I don't want to get too far into the Navalny stuff, but the little that I read about Navalny's reception is, I think there's a sense in Central Asia that a lot of Russian leaders, including those in power and the populace, like Navalny, and Zhenya Albat was, called Navalny a populist this morning on the Daily, New York Times Daily, although she's a dear friend of Navalny. But the reality is populism works, and this rhetoric of the greater Russian Empire is part of that discourse. And I think even beyond the Kremlin, I think Central Asians have a reason to be upset with this discourse. But again, Donna, set us straight here.
Yeah, I totally agree on Navalny. I think I will not be wrong if I say that people in Central Asia, especially in Kazakhstan, we all do believe that Navalny was a very brave man, but at the same time, his rhetoric was very, very nationalistic. And we, in Central Asia, people clearly remember that he initially never condemned the annexation of Crimea. He almost kind of approved it. And only later he, I think it was in one of his manifestos where he actually said, I regret not being more vocal on this point. In terms of the situation on the ground, I have to admit I haven't been to Kazakhstan for a year and a half. I don't know what is happening right now there on the ground, but what I hear from my friends, what I hear from my colleagues, my former colleagues, and what I read is that the situation is very, very tense, and people are very sensitive to any kind of statements that doubt Kazakhstan's sovereignty and the right for statehood. And this, I think, was manifested recently in the making Tina Kandelaki, one of the popular media personality in Russia, becoming a persona non grata in Kazakhstan.
Thanks. Gavin.
I would throw in, part of it is just a growing sense of insecurity based on the deflation of Russia's presence, number one. The resources, the military capabilities that Russia had before this war aren't the same as they had now. That assumption that Russia, if you needed them and they wanted to, they could intervene in Osh or wherever. Some of that's gone. But also, I have always sort of argued that Russia adopts different strategies on its frontiers in the former Soviet states based on threat vectors that they feel. So they feel threatened by NATO, and they have an aggressive policy towards the Baltic states or Ukraine. They have a policy of sort of stirring the pot and freezing the conflicts in the Caucasus, and they've always had a policy of sort of pragmatic defense in Central Asia. What I've been seeing increasingly is signs that maybe Russia is seeing Central Asia as a threat vector that's different than it has before, which means you could see a change in Russia's foreign policy stance towards Central Asia if they start to perceive that there's a vector. And the rhetoric, this is just looking at the rhetoric in Russian media about Central Asia, it sounds a lot more like they're talking about threats, threats to Russians, threat to Russian language, and that's got to frighten people, because this idea of Russia is sort of an occasionally unpleasant but basically friendly uncle that's going to or big brother that's going to always take care of you isn't that's changing for all of those reasons.
It seems kind of contradictory in that I mean, there has been I think as Gavin was stated, that there's been an increased level of aggressive rhetoric coming from Moscow about Central Asia. You mentioned Tina Kandelaki, you mentioned Dmitry Medvedev, and a host of others. But at the same time, the actual military presence of Russia in the region is diminished. In our conversation we had last week, Gavin, we talked a little bit about Tajikistan, where the 207th Division there's typically 5,000 plus Russian troops there, helping to defend the Afghan-Tajik border, and that pretty much for the 30 years in the first 30 years of the post-Soviet period, Moscow regarded that it was their security responsibility to defend, in essence, in Central Asia, what were the borders of the Soviet Union, but that capacity is diminished. Let me raise a different question. Actually, kind of, if you could follow on some Donna and others about the economic ties. It's quite striking that the data about capital outflows to Russia being so much higher than any other place in the world for Kazakhstan, and the dramatic increase of especially small and medium-sized Russian businesses. I mean, this seems to be counter to at least what the designers of economic sanctions towards Russia had in mind. What do you think is going on there in Kazakhstan, and to what extent is this dynamic replicated in other states of Central Asia? Why don't we start with you, Donna?
Yeah, sure. Great question. And I don't have very straightforward answers, because the situation the slide that I shared with you, it really puzzles me, because some people that are heads of those corporations that are actually on the sanctions lists, and they're still doing business in Kazakhstan. I understand that a lot of things are being done in the national currencies, mostly in rubles, but it's still, it feels to me that the government is going like on the very, very thin ice, on the very, very edge. Even if you take whatever is happening right now with Rosatom, just this, I think it was early last year when it became public that Russia took over 100% in the Stepnogorsk mining and chemical plant, and also got the 49% in the massive Budyonovskaya mine. If eventually sanctions against Rosatom and Russian uranium come forward, I don't know what's going to happen to the uranium industry of Kazakhstan. So I do myself have a lot of questions, and unfortunately, very, very, very few answers to this.
Gavin, Eric, any comments on the economic side of this curious set of relationships?
Well, as a political scientist, I would say, it's probably a good, as a Central Asianist political scientist, I guess, sort of happy that the idea that the Russian economy would collapse and take the Central Asian economy with it it didn't happen in the way that I was afraid of. But I think that you know, the trifecta of you know, sort of diminishing Russian influence would be military, ideological, which you sort of talked about a little bit, sort of an ideology that is hostile rather than friendly, and then Russia, you know, tanking economically and losing a lot of its economic leverage. Well, you know, we talked about the first one and the second one. I think, you know, we just haven't seen that, and I think I saw something in the last couple of days in my Kyrgyzstan feed that remittances have now, you know, are higher than they were before the full-scale invasion. You know, the economic impact has been less than I think all of us expected in the beginning.
Just
Eric, you
add a
want
few.
to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add a few points. I guess first off, we live in a global economy, and Russia is part of that global economy. Donna was talking about Rosatom. I have a dissertation student who actually maybe he's in the audience. I don't know. He's writing on this right now. You can't disentangle Rosatom from the global economy. I mean, power plants rely on this, right? Just like, you know, Russian hydrocarbons. And in the case of atomic, it's even more difficult to disentangle. And I guess the other thing that's potentially going on here is that, you know, Central Asia has become a port of entry for Russia, and so there's a lot of economic activity that's going on as a result of that, and that is, I would say, going on with the tacit approval of the very countries that are imposing the sanctions, right? I think Washington knows perfectly well that this is happening, and there's really, Washington cannot simultaneously sanction Central Asia and have Central Asia want Washington to be involved in Central Asia. So the sanctions, particularly with regards to Central Asia, I think are relatively toothless. The one place where it is being felt is in prices. And I'm not exactly sure what is driving the prices, but one thing that came up again and again in the focus groups is ordinary Central Asians are pissed off. And they're pissed off at Washington because the price of iPhones have gone up, or the price of any number of goods have gone up. And so in that spot, we're seeing the prices go up, and it's being attributed to Washington. I don't know if that's exactly right, but I'm not entirely surprised that we're seeing the dynamic that Donna presented in her presentation, because Russia's a global economic powerhouse, and it's going to continue to be.
In fact, the point about uranium, I mean, Kazakhstan has the largest reserves of uranium in the world. The one area, at least one area that has not been caught up in U.S. sanctions, has been the import of highly enriched uranium from the Russian Federation, which, as of a couple of years ago, was powering between 5 and 10% of all power generation in the United States. And so to take that out would be quite massive. And this is, I think I gave a talk for the largest lobby organization for the civilian nuclear power in the United States in January of 2022, just before the invasion. And my expectation then was that the Russians would do more to try to control the uranium resources in Kazakhstan. And from what you said, it sounds like that is the case. Eric, you mentioned the inflow of migrants. I mean, this is Russian migrants. This is really a striking phenomenon that, in response to the mobilization call on September 30th in 2022, hundreds of thousands of draft age young men in Russia ran to the exits, and a lot of them have come in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, have come into Central Asia. What do the three of you see the impact of this? And to what extent is it too early to tell? How, now we're 2 years into the war. The longer they stay, the higher the likelihood they will stay more more indefinitely? And also, if you could parse out the comment you made, Eric, about the level of remittances of the Central Asian guest workers going to Russia has increased. Now, is that mainly explained by the fact that so many the Russian workforce has left the country and or is fighting in Ukraine or has been killed? These guest worker and migrant flows are quite interesting phenomena. If you could take a little time and discuss that.
I think Donna made a comment about the remittances, but let me address. I think this came up in an earlier conversation we were having. My last visit to Kyrgyzstan, I was. I don't go back as far as Gavin does in working and visiting and living in the region. My first time in Kyrgyzstan was 1995, and I was struck by this most recent trip where it felt like there were more Russians in Bishkek than there were in 1995. So it was kind of shocking, and I think it cuts both ways. I think in general, there's not a huge amount of tension, but there's also this chauvinism that I had mentioned earlier. I think is palpable among, at least among my colleagues in Kyrgyzstan, that there is a large population that's recently arrived and are dismissive of not being able to find good coffee in Bishkek, which is laughable. The coffee in Bishkek is far better than the coffee around here. But I think there are tensions, and I think there's economic tensions that may be driving some of the price increases that we've seen. So it's something I think we have to pay attention to. But I take Gavin's point to heart. I mean, Gavin, I think, has warned us that we have a tendency to talk to colleagues who for example, Donna, right? I mean, very highly educated, the Central Asian elite, and this discourse of decolonization maybe not as widespread as the discourse among the people that we regularly interact with. But I'd be really curious to hear what Donna has to say about this.
Well, Donna?
I completely agree with you. It's very difficult to, when you sit outside the country, like myself, or when you are back at home and you like only visit Almaty or Astana, it's very difficult to know what is happening outside. I also want to note on the price increases. It's not only iPhones that are the prices are going up. It's every day, the basic necessity, grocery, food, everything is going up. And for some reason, I also don't have this explanation why this is happening. Something that I looked very carefully is that if you look at them, there was a question about the Eurasian Union in the chat. Kazakhstan is among the top countries where the price increase is for food, for basic needs, is so high, and much higher, like twice as high than in Russia, Kyrgyzstan, or Armenia, and or Belarus. And I don't know what is the explanation for that. Maybe it's also the transportation costs, which are extremely high right now in Kazakhstan. Everything that is being exported, imported, because of the, like how sensitive the Western companies are towards whatever is coming from Kazakhstan because of the economic involvement and connection with Russia. The insurance cost is very high, transportation cost is very high. Very difficult to answer this. And I'm not an economist to have good answers for that.
Gavin.
Yeah, so a couple of points about relocante, which is really hard to translate into English, relocated, but relocante or self-relocated. There's, like we were talking about, sort of the urban intelligentsia that you meet in cafes versus the rest of the people. Relocante really had two waves. The first wave were gig working, Starbucks drinking tech people who came when the invasion happened or in the run up to the invasion to sort of offshore their lives and their resources. And those are likely the Russians that you're going to meet in cafes in Almaty or in Bishkek. And then there was the wave that Andy, you kind of talked about, which are people who weren't necessarily against the war but didn't feel like fighting it once the mobilization happened. So it's two very different waves of relocanti. But one of the things that this is maybe a different podcast, but I keep throwing back to my former USAID colleagues and to State Department officials that I interact with on the European side. What's the plan for Russia? We all know what's going to happen with Ukraine. We're going to do a Marshall Plan and rebuild it and bring what's left of it into NATO and the European Union. But what's our Russia plan? I actually think that we have an audience in these relocanti, a public diplomacy opportunity, both for the United States and for the Central Asian countries themselves, to change the minds of a very influential group of Russians that are available for engagement. There's been a really mixed sort of reaction to Russian relocanti from the more decolonizing folks and the regular folks. I've seen a lot of it in the Caucasus, in Georgia, in Tbilisi. It's a lot more sort of anti-Russian. I really think that hundreds of thousands of Russians with some resources are a really important audience for however this war ends, if they go back to Russia or if they stay in Central Asia, to break through some of the stereotypes that lead people like Navalny to try to pander to negative images about Central Asians. So I like to challenge public diplomacy officers in the State Department to figure out how do you message to those people, how do you reach those people, and how do you change the way that they think about Central Asia and the outside world.
Thanks, Gavin. You might want to talk to Mike Johnson and the Republicans in Congress about the plan for Ukraine, and to remind them. It's very interesting in responding to Marcia McGraw-Olive's question about the EAU, Kazakhstan's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. One would think that the sanctions policy would lead to higher costs in Kazakhstan in a way that could be to some extent exported from Russia. But from what Donna said, that the inflation rate in Kazakhstan is much higher than it is in Kyrgyzstan or in Russia. There's a lot of counterintuitive, sort of data running out there. Just our colleague Ed Chow made a comment: "Isn't Western sanctions evasion big business? Lots of money to be made in the short term. Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong are also doing the same." I don't think that anybody would disagree with that.
Well, what does sanctions and evasion mean in the context? Central Asia isn't sanctioned, but it is in a sanctions bubble. It is surrounded by Russia, Iran, Afghanistan, and China. The middle corridor is the only part of the balloon that will let air out. But I think a lot of what I've heard from Kazakh officials is sanctions are often painted in categories that are too broad to allow for normal commerce, like toys, electronic, as opposed to toy drones with these chips. So a lot of what needs to happen is some clarification. But, Central Asians are in a really tough spot because, who are they going to trade with when they are completely surrounded by countries that we've already sanctioned. It sort of, it sort of begs the question of how they communicate with the outside world.
Well, it looks like some of the answer we're seeing is that they'll continue trade and investment relations, with the Russian Federation. Geography doesn't determine policy, but it's a significant factor in this case for sure. Let me turn to one other question. Before I went off to Bishkek 5 years ago to run the American University of Central Asia, I was given a piece of survey research that was done by, it was conducted in Kyrgyzstan. I'm not sure who carried it out, but the material was done at the auspices of INR and the State Department, and it's kind of consistent actually with the data that you had, Eric, from 2022, in looking at how Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan look at the United States, Russia, and China. And that at that time, the views toward Putin and Russia were in 90+% levels for Kyrgyzstan, whereas the views of China and the United States were both at similarly mediocre levels of around 25 or 30%. From the data you showed, Eric, it doesn't seem like that has changed significantly. And let me put the question maybe in a more provocative way. I mean, there is sort of a lot of conventional wisdom out there that since the war in Ukraine, that Russia's influence has been falling at the expense, and that China's is rising, and that there's and that there's a dynamic relationship between that. We're gonna have a full section on China, but I think that it would be helpful for the three of you to address the China and Russia question as from the perspective of Central Asian states.
Just quickly, I think that I would characterize China's situation as, they used to rely on the American occupation of Afghanistan, presence in Afghanistan, for security of Afghanistan in the region. Their international behavior for 20 years was, basically something that we answered for. And then Russia played the security role in Central Asia while China did the economic things. Well, with American withdrawal and with Russian distraction, deflation, whatever you want to call it, China has been presented with these dilemmas, these security dilemmas, on the Badakhshan border and other places. And it seems really reluctant to take on the security roles. Now they've made some Xi Jinping made some noise in Astana about respecting Kazakhstan's territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence, which seem to be aimed a little bit at Russia. But I think China hasn't seized all of the opportunity to fill in the vacuum that you might have expected if that was something they were highly motivated to do. I think they seem a little bit unwilling to take on some of the security issues in the region. And then I would constantly point out that I don't think that the Venn diagram with U.S., Russian, and Chinese interests in Central Asia is completely zero-sum. I think there are areas, especially in Central Asia, maybe more than other places in the world, where we might agree, the three of us even, on not letting Afghanistan become a source of terrorist fighters. We may have a lot more areas of possible collaboration. I think that's true with China, US. I think it's true with Russia, China as well. So I think zero-sum thinking isn't the best way to approach that question.
Eric or Donna, you want to comment on China, the China factor?
Do you want to go first, Eric?
Sure, and then you can kind of drive it home. On the China, I'm just on the China factor. I remain surprised and somewhat shocked at the amount of anti-Chinese sentiment in Central Asia. And I know there's reasons for it, and Xinjiang doesn't help. Aside that may be part of it. But I just wanted to bring the conversation a little bit back to the figures that we see with the United States and why they are the way they are. 1990s democracy promotion didn't go over well in Central Asia. Sorry, Gavin, but that was a struggle, right? Obama LGBTQ plus in U.S. foreign policy didn't go over well in Central Asia. Middle East and Afghanistan U.S. actions there doesn't go over well in Central Asia. I think we said we have to kind of de-link Central Asian. Central Asians don't think necessarily about the United States relative to Russia or relative to China. The reason why the United States is perceived the way it's perceived, I would argue, has nothing or very little to do with these other countries and a lot to do with how Washington has engaged the region. And we've made a lot of mistakes, and I've been part of those mistakes. We've all been part of those mistakes. So I think there has to be a lot of rethinking about how we engage the region. Whereas with Russia and China don't care about any of this stuff, right? They don't care about Central Asia being democratic. They don't care about the human rights. They don't care about any of the things that worry the autocratic regimes or, frankly, the predominantly Muslim population in Central Asia. We have made repeated mistakes, and I think we have to look very seriously about how we conduct our foreign policy.
Yeah. As the only Central Asian on this panel, I think I will conclude by saying, first of all, China this year overtook Russia as the major trading partner of Kazakhstan. And if you look at the Kazakh statistics, I think it's overwhelmingly underrepresented because usually our statistics with Chinese really deviate. But what I want to say about what I see in Central Asia, and maybe sometimes it makes me very proud being a Central Asia, it's maybe from my own, it's like the analogy with a family. When you have a kid who's 5 years old, you think you are, you have all the power in the family, you have all the money, you control this little creature of yours, and yet this little 5-year-old kid will find millions of ways to somehow challenge your authority. And when you talk about how US, China's, Russia's interest overlap in Kazakhstan, that's true, but it's also there is agency among the Central Asian leaders. And I really hope that the situation will not exacerbate so that they will have this agency. They will be able to preserve the independence and sovereignty, true sovereignty of their countries.
Thank you. I think that's a good point to conclude on, essentially, and it's kind of accentuating the point that Gavin was making earlier about the increased coordination amongst the 5 Central Asian leaders, which is at a higher level than it ever has been, from my perspective, in the 32 plus years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, you're 5 relatively small, Uzbekistan, the largest population of 35, well, maybe 40 million at this point, but relatively smaller countries surrounded by some very large neighbors and some other very challenging neighbors in different ways. I think you're bound to you can make a bigger impact as the kulak, the fist, rather than the 5 separate players themselves operating on their own. Well, let me thank all 3 of you for a really enlightening discussion. There's lots of meat on the bone for us to continue to chew on, and look forward to being in touch with you. And thank you for the audience for listening to our session today. And I hope that you will support our work and continue to follow the work we're doing here at the center regarding Central Asia and its connectivity with the rest of the world in the months and years ahead. Okay, thanks very much. Over and
Thank
out.
you so
До
much.
свидания.